Welcome back to Historic Investments. Today we're not going to talk about a specific gun. No, we're going to talk about a restoration project, because if you're like me, at some point in your collecting career, you've acquired one or maybe several guns that needed a little help. Something was just not quite right. Well, in this case, I picked up a CZ24, and quite frankly, I just completely missed the fact that the slide assembly had been touched up, and honestly touched up incorrectly. The strawed parts and the fire blued parts had the wrong finish, as did the grip screws. I guess I was more focused on the frame and the grips, but it doesn't really matter, because at this point the gun just simply doesn't look right. I'd like to bring back the straw, I'd like to bring back the fire blue on a couple of parts. So let's take a look and see how that's done. No, you're never going to bring it back to quite factory specs, but you can bring it back awfully close and make the gun look better. So if you like what you see, please like and subscribe. And if you've got any questions, please ask. We'd be very happy to answer them. So here we have our problematic early production CZ24. Major components should be rust blued, the extractor, grip screws should be strawed, and the firing retainer should be a fire blue. Well, as I mentioned, the slide assembly had been touched up. Let's take a closer look at the extractor. You can see here we go. The extractor is about the same color as the slide. Well, that's not really right, is it? You can also see that for whatever reason that the grip screws are blue, they should be strawed, and that's true for the grip screw on the other side. Again, here it is, it's blued. And you can also see, and I'm going to see if I can cone in just a little bit more, you can see that the right there, that the firing pin retainer, yes, it's a slightly different color than the slide, but it should be a vivid heat-tempered peacock blue, and instead it's not. So let's direct our early efforts to restrawing the extractor, restrawing the grip screws, and fire bluing the firing pin retainer. So at this point, the gun's been taken apart, and we need to confine our attention to the few parts that we're going to be heat treating, namely, again, the two grip screws, the extractor, and the firing pin retainer along with its retaining screw. First of all of these parts have the wrong kind of finish. The first part in this process is to remove the finish. We can do this in a number of ways, but stripping the old finish by way of low concentration acid bath is probably the easiest way to go. But even before you get started, you need to do a little bit of homework here. You can't just be stripping parts and heat treating them. You kind of need to know a little bit more about what you're doing. For example, if you're going to redo the grip screws and you're going to go through the trouble of what we're about ready to do, you should make it a point of knowing, well, just how are the screws polished when they left the factory? Well, I'll tell you what you don't do. You don't run the screw on a drill press or a hand drill and leave a lot of circular marks. I don't know if you can see this, but the original factory polishing, those are straight polish marks that went parallel to the slot groove. That's what we're going to try to reproduce before actually doing the heat treating. Another thing, what about the extractor? Well, it's the same kind of consideration. I don't know if you can see it here, but basically, as originally manufactured, the extractor would have a lot of machine markings. Yes, there's some perpendicular, but for the most part, these are cruder marks. For the most part, the marks would be parallel to the long axis of the extractor. So we're going to have to recreate that. And then what about the firing pin retainer? Well, that's a little bit different. Again, you can kind of see how the polishing marks are here and there, and they're different surfaces. So the surface right here, for example, this is how it fits in the gun. This is the top of the slide. These marks should actually be parallel to the top of the slide, and the marks here would be perpendicular to the top of the slide. So again, you want to kind of recreate those polish lines before the parts have been finished in the prep process and heat treated. So right now, let's move to removing the finish. We know how we need to polish the parts, and then we'll move on to the heat treating. So the first step is to degrease the parts, and there are various agents you can use, from just laundry detergent and soap to acetone and any kind of alcohol. The point is you need to get the surface clean of oil, so that in the next step, when we remove the blue with a very mild acid solution, the acid solution will be able to cover the surface uniform and do the best job possible in preparation for the heat treatment. So right now what I'm doing is to use a toothbrush to basically scrub the surface a little bit and get in all of the little recesses possible before we move into the acid bath. So again, you want to get these parts just as clean as possible before subjecting them to the acid solution. So the next thing we're going to do is to subject the parts to an acid bath. Now, we don't want the acid bath to be too strong because that might etch the parts before we're ready to take them out. So what I've done is I've put in about a 50 or 60% water dilution, and then we're going to add the muriatic acid. There we go. So let's take a look at these parts. This is a very good reason why to wear gloves. And you will see that already the salt blue is largely stripped off the extractor. So let's work it in this acid solution just a little bit longer. Well, it's turning gray. Most of the other parts are already stripped of their blue. This one's just a little bit finicky, so we're going to work it with the acid just a little longer. Okay, then I can show you that the, here we go, the grip screws. You can see the dome of the grip screw, and you can see that's already gray, so all of the salt blue has been removed. And let me also show you right now, here is the firing pin retainer, and again, see how that surface is gray? So again, all the salt blue has been removed, and as you can see, that just took a few seconds. So at this point, we're largely done with stripping the salt blue from the parts, so it's time to give them a rinse. Now, what you don't want to do is you don't want to rinse and have these parts fall down the sink. So you can either have a little bit of a grate on the drain, or you can just very slowly and carefully start to dump that dilute and dump out the water. One of the things you never want to do is to put the water in a pure acid bath, because then if it splashes, there could be some very, very unpleasant effects. So again, if you're going to use this muriatic acid, it's best to dilute it and always pour the acid into a water base, not the reverse. So now we've got our grayed extractor. Okay, you can see it's kind of gray and blotchy, and what we want to do, we want to freshen the surface so that when it comes time to strawing it, it'll have a fairly uniform hue. So we're going to go over this sandpaper a little bit. I've got a grinding stone, a flat stone on the bottom, so it'll respect the flat plane. And you can kind of see how I'm freshening the metal here. And what we want to do is to ideally make sure all of these movements are parallel to the surface. Here we go. And we're going to do the other one too. Again, when it left the factory, there were always some grind marks, so I wouldn't be bothered by that. You can see both sides are pretty freshened now, and now we're going to go to the exposed part. So you want to be really careful that you don't cant this piece, that it stays just flat on this grinding stone. What you don't want to do, in fact, what you almost never want to do with these restoration projects, is to hit a part with a buffing wheel. So let's take a look here. You can see it's mostly cleaned up. We still have a little bit of darkening right here in the end, so we'll just go after it a little bit more until that part is also freshened. Sometimes if you're really compulsive, you're not going to be able to get the innermost parts, so if you really want to clean those up, and I am kind of a compulsive guy, here I'm using a little wire wheel, but you can see I'm not really buffing the heck out of it. All I'm doing is very, very, very lightly cleaning the surface again, so that when the time comes, the heat treatment will look a little bit more uniform. So it's just more of a matter of just a very, very light burnishment. I don't really want to avoid out a lot of the machine marks that I have artificially induced with the sandpaper. This is just a very light surface cleaning. The thing we're going to do is to very, very slightly recontour the screw heads that have been made a little bit irregular by the previous effort. And as I mentioned, it's important to know how the manufacturers did the final machining. For the CZ24s, the machine marks go parallel to the screw slot. So in order to effect that, I've put the screw in a vise, and I'm using a relatively coarse 220 grit sandpaper to replicate the machining So So now we've finished making the pass with 220, and you can see it's just a little bit too coarse, so now we're going to lighten it up a little bit with some 400 grit paper. So there we have it. We've gone over the top of the screw with 2 different grits. We've tried very hard to respect the screw slot so it doesn't look dished or beveled. And you can see that the sanding marks are parallel to the slot. So what we're going to do is the same thing to the other screw. So now we're ready for the heat treatment. As you can see, all the surfaces are polished bright, and the original machine marks have been, they're not exact, but they've been roughly emulated. The next thing you want to do is to heat up the parts. Now, you'll need a specific temperature for a particular color. Say for strawed parts, you want to bring the temperature up to about 325, maybe 350 degrees. If you want that really nice cold peacock fire blue, that means you're going to have to raise the temperature to 500, 550 degrees, which is sometimes just outside the range of your kitchen oven. So you can do the strawed parts in your kitchen oven, but maybe it won't work quite as well for the fire blue parts. So if you think you're going to need to go up to a higher temperature, and sometimes different metals will require different temperatures to achieve the same color, what I come to rely on is this Lee lead melting pot. And here's a thermometer. So you've got a rheostat on the heating unit, and then it'll heat up the bluing salts, or actually the heating salts here. And then you can see what is the temperature of the salts, because for example, if you want the strawed part, you don't necessarily want the salts at 500 degrees. You want them closer, as I mentioned, to 300, 500 to 550 for the fire blue parts, and then you can just watch them change color. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug in this bullet mold heater, and it'll melt the heating substance here. We will check the temperature with this particular thermometer, and then when it reaches about 350 degrees, we'll put in the parts that need to be strawed, and then we'll raise the temperature to around 500, 550 degrees, and put in the one part, which is that firing pin retainer that needs to be a peacock blue. As the pot heats up, you're going to see these bluing salts, and again, it's not for salt blue, it's just called these heating salts or bluing salts. You know, they'll tend to bubble up, and don't worry about that. So the important thing is let's get the salts liquefied, let's get a uniform heat within the bath, and then we will immerse the parts. One of the things I need to point out is that it's really important that you secure the parts, because the last thing in the world you want to do is to drop a part in this heating solution, watch it drop to the bottom, and spend the next 20 or so minutes trying to fish it out while the salts are hardening around the instrument that you're using to fish out your part. So in this case, I'm using some very fine copper wire. If there's a hole around the part, I've looped the copper wire around the hole to make sure that the screws don't go to the bottom. I've wrapped it around the threading, and to make absolutely secure, I've also put a little loop through the screw slots. And for this part, you can use your imagination. And as I said, if the temperatures are lower, like for strawed parts, just throw the parts in your oven when your wife is gone. It'll be fine. That's been going for a few minutes, and the temperature it's now stable at 550 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're going to remove the thermometer, and we're going to put in the small part that needs to be peacock blued. So now I'm ready to put in the small firing pin retainer that needs, as you remember, that's the part that needs to be fire blued. So we've got a uniformly heated solution. We're moving the part around a little bit very gently so that the heat uptake on the part is uniform. And we're going to have to really check the heat very carefully. Look at that. It's already changed to a purple. This is really very quick. We don't want to overcook it. You know, just like that. Now it's kind of a purplish brown. It's not going to be much longer. Now it's approaching a reddish purple. We're getting very close. Here we go. Now I think we've got our blue. Hold it. There we go. We've got just a little bit longer, and we're there. Total time was less than 2 minutes. So here we are, fresh out of the tempering bath. And we've got just a beautiful peacock blue on the firing pin retainer. How about that? I've turned the temperature down and it's time to put in the extractor. Same technique. You put it in and you swirl it around. If you can keep it near the surface, you can usually see the color changes as they occur. There we go. I don't know if you can appreciate it, but that is a very nice orangish straw. One of the last things for the compulsive collector is to make sure that your newly restrawed or fire blued parts matches with the rest of the gun. So if you've got a 95% gun, you really don't want a 110% restrawed small parts. So you need to put a little wear, just tone it down a little bit. You can either do that chemically or put a little bit of abrasion on the dome of the screw. I've got a kind of a soft wood block here. The other thing people have done is to just rub the screws against some leather covered objects, or maybe a third alternative is to use just a very, very, very light acid mix and just barely touch the dome of the screw with that. There are a variety of ways, and it really is just a matter of personal preference. So here's what we're looking at afterwards. You can see, just as with normal wear and tear, it's the dome of the screw that tends to thin out a bit. You can see the straw is a little bit thinned right at the dome, and then near the periphery where it's protected by the grip, you can see the full-bodied straw. So here we are. We've come to the end of our special project in Firearm Restoration 101. We have strawed both of the grip screws, and then we have toned them down in a way that they'll be consistent with the trigger. Hopefully you can see how the dome of the screw is kind of a brighter metal, and you can see the strawing that extends into the periphery, and that's the same kind of wear appearance that you see to the right on the trigger. Here we have the extractor, which is now properly strawed with the correct machining marks, which are parallel to the axis of the extractor. And again, compare the colors to the trigger. A really, really nice match. Same for the grip screw on the other side. And then now let's take a look at the firing pin retainer, and you can see it's got that nice peacock fire blue with just a little bit of fading, which would be again correct for the overall condition of the pistol. Now, it certainly doesn't hurt that this is also one of the Nazi Test Marked guns. Again, not exactly the point of this exercise, but it sure doesn't hurt that we did this on a historically interesting firearm. Hopefully you guys found it interesting to learn how to either restraw or refire blue some of the small parts in your early development firearms. I'm sure there are a lot of other techniques out there, and frankly I'd like to hear from you guys. The other thing is, let me emphasize that with this kind of restoration process, there's no intent to defraud or deceive. I mean, if you really know what to look for, no matter how good you are, there are always a few little telltale signs that'll differentiate original parts from parts that have been helped or enhanced. But with that in mind, you make your own decisions. Hopefully, next time you embark upon a restoration project, these tips will help you. So with that in mind, good luck and good collecting.